Okay, right, Charlotte, I'm just going to hand over to you, make you host, and then you can share your screen.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Go. Should be able to share now, hopefully.
Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Right. I lost my other. What have I done? Got to find my screen now to come back to you. Right. So everybody can see that, so that's perfect. So I'll go through. Fiddle that on. Yeah, right. Just checking that's all working. Okay, my name's Charlotte Bowles-Lewis. I was a conservation officer working at Gloucester City Council for about 13 years. Prior to that, I was an archaeologist and I did a master's course at Oxford Brookes, which I think is sort of the common route that most conservation officers tend to get involved in built heritage. I ended up actually enjoying dealing with monuments and buildings rather than being in the ground, poking about in the mud and in the rain, hence why I ended up as a conservation officer. Working in Gloucester was wonderful as well. Lots of diverse different buildings, timber framing, stone, brick, Georgian, everything that you could want actually. So very lucky to have a very good grounding. And I've now got my own heritage consultancy, hence why I'm talking to you today in sort of a different capacity really through that role. So today is a little bit about going through what is a listed building, the sort of common myths about when you're dealing with listed properties, a little bit on repair and maintenance, talking about when repair is an alteration, because I know that can be a bit of a minefield for homeowners as to what they are actually allowed to do and what they can't do without listed building consent. And I've also included at the end just a little bit about energy efficiency and upgrading works, because again, that's something which tends to be common questions which people have. And I know it's difficult sometimes accessing information, and it's also difficult with local authorities now in terms of having to pay for advice. So having to go through a pre-app when you just want a simple answer to a question, or putting in a listed building application and it taking forever to come back, and that you might actually want something which is a bit more of a quick fix. I'm going to start off talking about what is a listed building. Click through, there you go. So a listed building is identified as one of being special architectural or historic interest. It's compiled by the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, commonly referred to as DCMS, and Historic England are the ones who hold the list. So they compile a list that's sent off to the Secretary of State for approval, and the sorts of buildings that may be added to the list, or monuments that are added to the list, could be things like telephone boxes, letter boxes, walls, gates. Those all come under the term as a building. And the example that I've put up here is of Sissinghurst, and this is the tower, and it was built in 1560s, and this dates to grade dates to 1560s, and it's grade 1 listed. It's quite a beautiful structure. There's 3 different grades of a listed building, and I've put up a couple of examples here. I'm not sure if you can work out which one's which on there, but the highest grade of buildings is grade 1. They're of exceptional interest, and there's only 2.5% of listed buildings across the country. We then have grade 2-star buildings. These are categorised as something as more than special interest, and they roughly make up about 5.8% of listed buildings. But I think most of us generally tend to know listed buildings as grade 2 properties. They tend to be the most common form of terraces, and that's about 90% of structures which are made up of grade 2 properties. And the examples that I've put up, so we've got Westbourne 7, and that's the tower, which is in the top left-hand corner of the top right-hand corner of the screen. It's a detached church tower and spire, dates to the late 13th century. Really interesting structure. It's got quite thin stone rubble walls, but it's also got, in terms of the spire construction, which is shingled, and that's not often seen, and has recently actually had some grant funding, and it's just been restored. Beautiful building. If anybody's local, they do open it up and you can get up into the timber frame tower to go and have a look at it. So that's it was re-roofed in 1779 in terms of that. And then the other property which we've got is on the top left is Covenant House. This is sort of a typical grade 2 listed building in the Cotswolds. This dates back to the 16th century, was a vicarage, and is a property I've actually been working on, which has been recently sold and refurbished, as it was a bit of a step back in time to the 1970s, as not a lot had been done in there, so needed complete restoration. But that's certainly the sorts of buildings that you would get that are grade 2, other, you know, terraced houses, those sorts of things. And the image at the bottom, again, if you're local, some of you might recognise it as the Folk Museum in Gloucester. So that one's grade 2 star. It dates from 1645, commonly referred to as Bishop Hooper's house. That's because people believe that he stayed there on the night before he was burned at the stake in 1555. We're not sure whether that actually happened or not, as there's no evidence, but the museum claim to have a part of the burnt stake in the museum. So if you're ever interested, go and have a little look, as I'm sure they'll be very accommodating to welcoming to you. So the next bit to talk about is, how do you decide what special interest is? And this is defined by Historic England, and there's several categories of how this is considered. So the first one is age and rarity. So generally, most buildings built before 1700, or buildings built between 1700 and 1840 are added to the list. The second category is that of architectural interest. So that looks at things like design, designation, decoration, craftsmanship. Is it a really good example of a particular building type or a particular building technique? Or it could be a building which has a particular plan form, so that's its physical layout of rooms. Historic interest is the third category, and I think that's probably one of the most important aspects that's looked at, and that could include anything from social, economic, cultural, or military history that would be taken into consideration. There's also historical association, so is it linked with a particularly important person or a significant event? Again, that would be nationally recognised rather than something more locally. And finally, group value. So this could be looking at an important architectural quality or historic group. So things like a square or a particular terrace or model villages. And it's noted that model villages sort of less than 30 years old are only listed if they're of outstanding quality and under threat. So examples of sort of terraces, thinking about Bath Crescent, you know, is a particularly good example of architectural interest, or Queen Square in Bristol, that could be another example. And then a couple of questions in terms of common myths. I think I'd be a millionaire if every person that said to me, it's only the front that's listed, but it isn't. It is actually the whole building. So the listing refers to the whole building, interior and exterior, as well as any object or structure which is within its curtilage. object or structure could be fixed to the building, could be inside or out. And in terms of its curtilage status, it has to be there since before the 1st July 1948. So that, in general, in terms of curtilage of a principal listed building, it has to be ancillary and is a key part of the listing. There's sometimes uncertainty in terms of that, and I often get asked lots of questions about whether something is curtilage listed. And Historic England have finally recognised that now, because actually when we do see new list entry dates, they do include buildings that are curtilage listed, or they may in particular express areas which are not listed or not curtilage. So that's something actually which is really helpful that has recently come in, but it can cause quite a bit of debate. There's always lots of questions about items that are curtilage listed or not. The courts have a number of cases in terms of the extent of curtilage, because it is a complex question. It does depend on the facts provided in individual cases. So the key considerations when you're looking at whether a building is curtilage, so it's the physical layout of the buildings, it's the ownership of the buildings, both past and present, and then you're also looking at the ownership at the time of listing, the function of the buildings, as well as the spaces past and present. So those are the sort of key tests that anybody would go to in terms of defining whether a property is curtilage listed or not, or an outbuilding or an object. Some sites have a particularly clear curtilage. So if you think about a typical dwelling house, its garden, it would have a defined boundary wall. That would be its curtilage. So that's a very easy one. Not every building has a curtilage. If you think in particular of a building in the town centre, which fronts straight onto a pavement, it doesn't have any outside space or any courtyards, then that's quite clearly a very easy building to draw your red line round if you so wanted. The curtilage may be in separate ownerships, so you could have things like a country house and stable block, which are in residential dwellings. Even if they're in separate ownership but on the same site, they could still be considered curtilage within listing purposes. So it should be noted that it's important to establish what is listed, as it's a criminal offence to fail to apply for listed building consent when it's required. And we always ask that you seek any advice from the local authority. But Historic England does have a really good advice note, which is listed buildings and curtilage, and that gives some really good examples in terms of working out what may be considered curtilage listing. It's a very difficult topic, and it's probably something that you may wish to seek some professional advice on, or please do speak to the conservation officer if you are struggling. So listed building descriptions. These are really helpful actually, some more helpful than others, but each listing includes a listing entry number, the date the building was listed, and information about its location. It includes a description of the building. Generally the description is to aid identification of the building, so it could just be a very basic exterior, few lines in terms of setting out terraced house, timber sash windows, slate roof, stone boundary wall, for example. And it really was literally at the time when most properties were listed during the 1950s, drive-by viewings, and they did do it as an identification tool. Generally, more modern entries set out a lot more comprehensive assessment of the special interest of the building at the time of designation, but it should be noted they are not comprehensive or exclusive record of the special interest or significance of the building, and the amount of information really will vary. Any omission from the list description of a feature, whether interior or exterior, does not indicate it's not of special interest. It doesn't mean it's excluded. And again, you need to think about that if you're doing any alterations. So generally from 2013, most newer entries by Historic England do include something which might not be of special interest, and I think that's really helpful. Generally, it tends to be things like modern 1960s extensions or a modern porch, where they'll say that it's excluded from listing.
Charlotte, are you open to questions as we go through? Would you rather us keep them to the end?
To the end is helpful, but if you've got something particularly on what I've just mentioned, I'm happy to take a question.
It was just a very quick question about Historic England and their listing enhancement service and how that works in practice. It was something I've only recently become aware of, and but it seems very few people are aware of it. I was wondering if you had any experience of it.
Yeah, I've recommended clients to use it mainly because I think it's helpful, actually, because some of the descriptions, especially if you've got a building which is 2-star or grade 1 and it doesn't have a great list description, or you've got complex curtilage buildings and you're not sure where things might relate, then it is worth doing. It is a paid service, so you do have to pay for that. So that's just something to bear in mind, really, when you're thinking about using it. It's probably not something that most average homeowners would want, but I think where you've got something complex or you're doing something significant to your property, it can be quite helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. It's a common myth that grade 2 buildings are easier to modify than grade 1. All the grades, whether it's 1, 2, 2-star, they're all the same. So there is no difference in the listings. So every listed building is of national importance, and none are more important than the others. Yes, there's higher levels of significance within each, and that's assessed when works are done. But that's something to bear in mind, because it's quite often we'll get comments of, oh, it's only grade 2. Well, it's still a grade 2 listed building of national importance. So that's something to think about when you're doing works. A couple of sort of common statements that I've had over time, which I think always sort of make you chuckle after working in local government for quite some time. The works were done more than 5 years ago. The council planners can't do anything. That's not actually the case with listed buildings. So yes, if you had a normal dwelling house which wasn't listed or didn't have any statutory protection, then there is some element in terms of enforcement that nothing can be done. But actually with listed buildings, there is no immunity period. Listed building notices can be served many years later, and certainly on current homeowners that actually had no involvement when the works were carried out. And I think that really is something to be very wary of when you are purchasing properties, to make sure that the previous owner acknowledges it, and you've had that conversation before you purchase the property, so you really know what's been done. Does it have consent? If it doesn't have consent, you as the new owner are liable to rectifying those. So that's something which could be very costly when taking on a new building, but also in terms of dealing with conditions and standards, that's something that you really need to think about and should probably negotiate as part of any new deal that you do, really. Saying you didn't own it, I'm just the agent, architect, surveyor, I couldn't be prosecuted. Again, if you've been involved in the works, you can be prosecuted. So I've dealt with several cases where agents and architects and surveyors who have worked with a homeowner haven't gained consent and have carried on regardless. They have been fined for those works. So that's just something to bear in mind, that you're making sure that you're following due process and advising your client to get those appropriate consents and doing the work as you should. In terms of nothing will happen if I don't get the correct consent, all the same issues apply, and it really is worth thinking about having those conversations. And even when considering rectification works, so if you're putting in a retrospective application, have those conversations, have good liaison with the conservation officer, enforcement officer. So those are things that I think it's always really helpful to have that advice, make sure you follow the correct process, and just start thinking about the sorts of things that you can and can't do. And if you've got a solicitor, generally make sure that they are asking those questions as well. If you're buying a property, that's something which often gets missed when people have purchased. I've had a few people say, I didn't know it was a listed building, or I didn't know it was in a conservation area, the solicitor didn't tell me. So those are things, and they're things that you can do yourselves as well. You can quickly check online through Historic England websites. All of the buildings are identified on there, so it's quite an easy click to see if your property's identified. Another common myth, it's only old buildings that are listed. You know, yes, whilst the vast majority of listed buildings in the UK are built before the 19th century, there's certainly possibility for more recent structures and properties to gain listed status. Again, it can relate to an association with an event or a person. And just to note, anybody can contact Historic England to request that a building is given listed status. It's not too difficult in terms of doing that. There is a form on the Historic England website. They like you to send in lots of photographs and provide as much information as possible. But anybody can book them in. Generally, it tends to be sort of more local history societies and those sorts of groups that tend to add them in. But I've done a few in my time as a conservation officer. And a couple of examples of the more modern buildings. You might like it, you might not like it. So this is an example of a modern building from 1983. So this was designed as part of its postmodern developments, designed by someone called Campbell, Wilkinson and Goff. And the reason for designation on the listed building description states it's a seminal example of postmodern architecture in Britain. So China Wharf combines geometry with considered contextual references, the bold riverfront Baroque curves responding to the scale of the Thames, while the landward elevations allude to 19th century warehouses. So I don't know, I suppose everybody's different there on that one. You may like it, you may not. Historic interest, they talk about an early example of a regeneration scheme in London Docklands, and it's also got group value with the listed warehouses. I think it's quite interesting. I'm not sure whether I would put it forward for listing, but as I say, sometimes it can be down to taste as to whether you like it or not. And another example that I've got here, which again is a recent listing. So this is a building that was put up in 1991 and it was listed in 2018, and it's an extension to the National Gallery in London. It's referred to as the Salisbury Wing, and so this has been done by Shepherd Robson Architects. Again, they talk about the design which reflects with the Grade 1 listed National Gallery itself, and talks about the quality of the building. It's highly individual design, achieving balance of old and new, and talks about the lack of alteration and legibility as part of the overall concept. I think it works quite well. It's got, again, Grade 1 listed status with the Wilkins building that it's attached to, and it's also next to a Canada House, which is Grade 2 star. So it's probably one to go and have a look at if you're in London. In terms of delisting, you know, once a building's listed, it can never be delisted. Actually, yes, it can, although it's very difficult in terms of having a property or monument delisted. I've only ever dealt with one. And again, for those of you that are local, you might recognise this. This is Provident Mill at Baker's Quay in Gloucester. This had a fire several years ago. The building was completely gutted, and it meant that actually nothing left there was salvageable. Very heartbreaking as a conservation officer having to deal with something like that. So really, having a building being delisted only happens if it's demonstrated that the building, one, shouldn't have been listed in the first place, so there might have been inaccuracies in terms of the reasons why it was listed, or if there's a substantial change as to reasoning why the building could no longer be deemed worthy of listing, and it mainly tends to be fire reasons as to why properties end up being delisted. So I'm going to go on and talk about works to a list of properties that wouldn't necessarily require consent. So these are the sorts of things that if you're a homeowner or you're advising a client in terms of doing work, where they could carry on and do those without having a formal application. So things like maintenance, general minor repairs don't generally need consent. Repairs is a difficult term because what one person thinks is a repair, the conservation officer may not. So things that I tend to talk about for like repairs generally could be something like a slip slate. So you've got to get up on the roof, you need to go and put 2 or 3 slates back. It's natural blue slate roof, so you would get some natural tiles and put them back on. Or you've got a Cotswold stone roof, you would get a Cotswold stone tile to match or reclaimed, and you would put it back up there. So that would be fine. You could carry on and do that and not require any consent. Once you start thinking about, okay, I need to replace more than 50% of my roof, then that tends to blur into a little bit more of, actually, that's beyond the scope of maintenance work. So there is a definition for repair, and that's defined as work beyond the scope of maintenance to remedy defects caused by decay, damage or use, including minor reduction to achieve a sustainable outcome, but not involving alteration or restoration. So that's the key words there in terms of alteration or restoration, which is where it would trip into requiring listed building consent. So it's important because buildings are listed, generally they are of traditional construction, so they use materials which are traditional, such as stone, the use of lime. Those sorts of things are important when you're then led, when you're putting back. So you need to think about using those traditional materials. Things, again, in terms of thinking about rainwater goods, a lot of people take down cast iron rainwater goods and put back plastic ones. Again, that's considered an alteration. So it's inappropriate to replace historic fabric with modern materials, and that's where it becomes an alteration. Things like replacement of kitchens. So if your kitchen's dated, you don't want to move it around, all of the plumbing remains in the same place, you can take that out, put it back. You know, that's an easy thing to do. You can repaint inside unless you've got, depending on your building, I don't know if you've got a wall painting in there, or if you've got historic wallpaper, then obviously you need to start having a think about having a chat with your conservation officer. But if you're a standard property, then you can go in and redecorate. You can, if your building's already painted externally, you can paint it in the same colour once you start changing colours. Or you've got a stone property and you want to paint it, or brick property and you want to paint it, then you would need consent. Again, adding a new bathroom in the same location, not difficult, you can do that, as well as the addition of secondary glazing or draft proofing. Those are the sorts of things that you can add in. So it's important to remember repairs should not include the removal of historic fabric or changes to its character. And things about repairs, you're thinking about a very light touch. So when is a repair an alteration? As I was saying, the definition is an alteration which makes a material change to the character or appearance of a listed building. That would require consent. So that could range from significant alterations to things like blocking up windows, taking down chimney stacks, removal of internal walls, complete re-roofing of your listed building. Then you would need listed building consent. But it's only required where significant historic fabric is being removed. When you're thinking about internal heating or kitchens, bathrooms. Once you start moving those around in the building, so if you want to relocate your kitchen and bathroom to different parts of the house, then you would have to think about plumbing routes, think about ventilation. Again, that would be something which would trip into needing listed building consent. In general, replacement of windows, removal of historic doors, removal of fireplaces, replacement of external doors, all of those sorts of things that would also require consent. So listed building consents required, and this again is just reiterating what we've been talking about. So alterations, that includes partial demolition and extensions, demolition in itself, repairs to historic fabric that do not match what's there precisely, and where repairs are on a like-for-like basis but require extensive removal of historic fabric. So again, things that can often end up being sort of disregarded as part of works, things you need to think about is loss of original plaster to walls, taking up floorboards, removal of any decorative features such as skirting or cornices or door architraves. Staircases, again, are another common area where people are reconfiguring properties and taking staircases out. If you're taking out plasterboard walls or stud walls, generally that's acceptable, but you would need listed building consent. And again, that might sound a bit odd because it's modern fabric, but sometimes those partition walls could be delineating something that was there historically. So that could contribute to the spatial character of the building. So that's sometimes where you might need to think about some of the works that you're doing. Other things to think about could be alterations to boundary walls that you might wish to consider, or gate piers, gates, railings. Again, you'd need to think about whether they predate 1948 and whether they would be courtesy listed. Television aerials, satellite dishes, all sort of common paraphernalia, alarm boxes, those sorts of things again would also need listed building consent. If you're putting in an alteration or extension, thinking about demolishing an extension, you'd need listed building consent and also planning permission. So those are all the sorts of things that you need to think about when you're talking about doing alterations internally. Maintenance. So maintenance is described as sort of routine works to keep fabric in good order. Generally, the aim of maintenance is to do it regularly, take prompt action, remedy problems quickly, and it's definitely the most cost-effective way of looking after your property. Good maintenance means that you don't end up dealing with some of these ongoing issues that can often crop up if you've left something like a hole in the roof or lead work or dripping down pipe, as in the case in here, which this particular property is suffering from significant water ingress problems within their render. Often seen as mundane, but actually it really is the cornerstone of building conservation. And I've included a maintenance checklist, which might be of interest to you all just to have a look at. So this sort of sets out all of the things that can often be ignored. Think, you know, block gutters, moss on the roof, block drains, downpipes not connected, growing plants up against the wall. If you're using the incorrect paint on windows, they don't tend to breathe. Blocking up vents, you know, which people think are drafty, they're actually there for a reason. Again, the same with the loft, and making sure that there's missing roof slates and your roof is kept watertight. So that's just a very quick and easy checklist that you can do once a year to have a look at. Emergency works. This is something which you can carry out without consent, but you do then need to have a retrospective application afterwards in terms of setting out the work that you've done to get the consent. It's always advisable to have that specialist advice and also have images taken to demonstrate the condition of the building. So they're usually defined as works being urgently necessary. You couldn't secure it in any other way by using temporary props or putting a plastic sheet over an area to keep it watertight. You have to provide notice in writing prior to works being undertaken to the local authority to state that you're doing those works and why they're considered as an emergency. So a little bit now just about energy efficiency and upgrading. I think the common misconception is that people think that older houses are not energy efficiency and must be radically upgraded. Actually, in reality, it's quite a complex situation, and making assumptions about poor performance are not always justified. Somebody's not on mute there. It's energy and carbon performance of older houses. It can be improved. You have to sort of strike the right balance. But generally, I advocate a whole house approach, and this is what Historic England also advocate. So don't think about one particular area. You have to think about the building as a whole, and you need to assess all of the property and then think about how those measures can be added and over what time. You don't have to do everything at once. You can do it, you know, in a bits and bobs nature. It's not too difficult, but every property is different. You need to look at the condition of your home, how it's orientated. Is it particularly exposed to the elements? You need to think about payback of what you're installing, ease of installation, impact on its historic character, and compatibility with its construction. So some things work in modern buildings, some things certainly don't work in historic buildings. So you have to think about how compatible they are when you're planning those improvements, and especially to deal with the fact that historic buildings take a long time to heat up. They then maintain their heat but cool down more slowly, so they can buffer moisture and, you know, don't tend to have too much fluctuation in terms of humidity and temperatures. But you generally say that I would have a look at Historic England's guidance on energy efficiency, and they've got quite detailed documents. In terms of sort of, for me, the four most important factors I would say when you're looking at it is the location of the property and its orientation, as it will be affected by its exposures to wind, rain and sun. The construction, the materials and components and their condition will affect any energy performance. Heating, cooling, lighting, ventilating, all use energy. You know, what are you using to cook? How are you entertaining? Again, those are things to think about. Do you have enough ventilation? And people, because we all use our house in different ways. So, you know, somebody could like something particularly hot, another person might not, and quite happy to be in a bit more of a cooler environment. So those are the things to look at. And I've just done a little quick checklist of the sorts of things that you can do, which are very quick and easy. So adding insulation to your loft, things like draft proofing, windows, doors, loft hatches, openings, they're really easy to do. You don't need list of building consent, and there's, you know, some real standard products out there now that you can use. Wooden shutters internally, insulated blinds, thick curtains, again, great ways to stop the drafts. Floors, if you've got timber floors, they could be lifted and you can insulate between them. And again, with chimneys, if you're not using it, you can put up a chimney balloon, again, to stop drafts. You can look at insulating your water tank, insulating pipes, avoid, you know, it's just simple things, avoiding opening windows and doors when the heating's on, turn off unused lights, again, all general items. Windows seems to be the most common question about wanting to change. Wood obviously is the most sustainable. It's been used for hundreds of years. It's a renewable material. Hence, it means with the benefit of windows, they are repairable. They're very attractive, and in terms of retaining those. Historic England is very clear about the loss of traditional windows from older properties is one of the major threats to our heritage. And we are now dealing with more replacement windows than ever before in terms of wanting to see double glazed windows going in. So whilst you might think that UPVC will give you that added energy efficiency, it's not very sustainable. It doesn't decompose and you can't repair them. So those are the sorts of things that when you're thinking about being sustainable and energy efficient, then actually windows are the way to go. And having timber windows, they're low carbon. And there was a little study done by the university up in Leicestershire, which compared plastic windows and wooden windows in 10 different environments, looked at sustainability, recycling, toxicity, and found that UPVC had significantly increased the impact on the environment than timber window frame options. And when you're looking at replacements, I think it would be particularly very rare that you would be allowed to put UPVC in a listed building. I can't think of many instances where this has been allowed, but it's sort of more common in other changes in terms of conservation areas. And I'll just put in a bit on secondary glazing. That's something that you can add in without listed building consent to your property. There's good secondary glazing and bad. I think when most of us think about it, we think about the ones which are particularly chunky and a bit hefty, but they are particularly good at reducing drafts and heat loss, and they're something which are probably sort of one of the things that I would say to have a look at if you're looking at doing alterations to your windows. And then my last bit of information is looking at solar slates. These are really easy to add in. You can put them in sort of interior slopes, you could put them on the garage, you could have them externally within your garden boundary and enclosed in what room door. I think the one thing to think about is just actually, if you are replacing your roof, then you might want to think about actually, is there somewhere or is there a modern section of roof that I could add them to, rather than I've got an historic roof, I'm going to take it off and put solar slates. So I think it's the time to do it is thinking about lifespan and whether you need a whole new roof at the time, and then start considering whether you could add in any solar slates to those. And again, they've got better over the years. They are certainly improving in terms of their efficiency.
Charlotte.
Hello.
Just on that subject with solar panels, we're looking at buying a list of property at the minute, a grade 2 list of property. I spoke to the local conservation officer, and he seemed to be very stern in the opinion that it's a no-no. This was about a month ago when we first looked at buying the property. But over the last month, it has become out more and more public that London and things like that are allowing people to put solar panels on grade 2 listed. So is it a localized thing, or is it something that you could? Because they do say one of this recent things I've just read says you can put up to 4 kilowatts without planning permission from your local council on a grade 2 listed building.
Well, yeah, you would still need listed builder consent for that. So planning permission is one thing, but in terms of any changes to your listed building, you would still need to have listed building consent for any works. But I think it's a difficult one. Every building is assessed on its own merits, but I would say if it's not particularly prominent in the street scene, works need doing to the roof, or there's a location in the garden, as I say, or on a garage, that you could put integrated panels, and they don't, if it is slates and you're putting those sorts of slate roofs on, actually you can't necessarily determine them or see them. So I think as long as they're not obvious, then I think it's something which most conservation officers are starting to look at now, and there's definitely more pressure from councillors and members to have such improvements being put into listed buildings. But as I say, it's got to be thought about in the round. So it could be that you could put other measures in that work equally as well. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, right, cheers.
Okay. So I've just put up a couple of links here, just sort of some of the references that I've been talking about in terms of help for owners. There's information there on energy efficiency, energy savings trusts, retrofitting measures. And then again, if you're doing anything with ironwork, a couple of specialist registers. So if you're requiring any specialist help, there's a really good website on the IHBC that lists people that can give you that advice. There's a structural engineer register again, and again the same with Lime forums and tradespeople. So hopefully that might give you a little bit of a good steer about where to go and the sorts of things which, as a conservation officer back in the day, I used to be able to help people with. But as I say, I think most people I speak to now struggle to talk to their conservation officer unless they're embroiled in a planning application or listed building application. So hopefully some of those things will help you. But yeah, any questions? I know it's a bit of a rattle through all of that, I'm afraid, but
Charlotte, hi, sorry, if I could kick off with a question. So I'm admin on a group that we are listed building. It's Your Old House UK, and we're SPAB aligned. And one of the things that comes up quite a lot, and indeed I'm having this myself personally at the moment, you mentioned, the notion of ask your conservation officer, but at the end you alluded due to cuts and so forth. Really, the only option is to become either do some sort of pre-app, go through full LBC, and we see all the time people saying, "Can I sand these boards? They're pine, they're 1970s. The house was listed in 1982." Is there any advice that someone with your experience can give to people in that position, where, because otherwise we're forcing people into making decisions themselves for what is of historic, of historically significance to the building? Yeah, I mean, or are we just in that inevitable position now where people will either, some will bite the bullet and get stuck into what might be a very protracted period for something that they should never even have, have approached the council, or otherwise end up doing inappropriate things where they think they're not doing harm? Yeah,
it's a real difficult one, but I think I generally tend to point people towards, I think I've just put the first link up there. So Guide for Owners of Listed Buildings by Historic England, really good document. It has all of the main basics. So like, where you're talking about sanding floorboards, when I was talking about refitting your kitchen, painting, I need a new boiler. It answers all of those questions in that document. And I say that's your sort of go-to for anybody that has those odd questions. That's where I would point them in the direction of. And that does sort of eliminate some of those questions that you would think, oh, do I need to talk to a conservation officer, or who do I talk to about that? That was what I'd say is first port of call. Really good document.
Yeah, I had looked, funny enough, I had looked this morning, and even that said, ask your conservation officer. It's like,
I think the problem is everybody themselves, don't they?
Yes, they do.
It's one of those, but
it's a very good document.
It is. It's probably one of the better ones. It's sort of taken some time for them to, shouldn't say get their act together, but it does feel like they're producing better guidance, which is a bit more definitive now. So,
I noticed you mentioned LPOC, and for £50 a year, they're phenomenal as well, and they give great advice to anyone who's not a member. I'd highly advocate that.
Yeah, no, both are very good. So that's generally what I would say. I know some councils do have a bit of an inquiry service, so you can send off a question and they'll come back with a bit more of a generic answer. I think it's really difficult with pre-apps. I would say you only start going down pre-app routes when you want to do significant alterations. So you want to do an extension, you want to take out, historic walls, you want to completely reconfigure your house. I think I work in the Cotswolds and they charge up to £1,000 for a pre-app advice. So, you've got to be doing something serious to make it worth the money, I think, before you engage. Have we got any other questions out there? I think there's a couple that came in the chat, isn't there?
Charlotte, I've got a question. We've got an area of hanging rag slate that some of the slates are very, very large and they're very vulnerable to wind damage. A few have slipped already. I intend to have them taken off and refixed in exactly the same position. There might be one or two that need replacing. Do I need listed building consent for that?
Not for the odd one, so that would be considered as a repair. So where you're taking something off you're putting something back on, you know, you're reusing it, and if you need to replace one or two, then that's fine. The thing where we start saying consent's required is generally sort of where you end up taking sort of more than 30% off, you know, or wholesale replacement of all of them. So that's,
well, this is an area probably about 4 meters by 5 meters that I was intending to take off and put back in exactly the same position, but refixed firmly. There might be one or two that need replacing. Do I need consent for taking off the whole of the hanging slate?
If you're taking all of it off, yes. But if you end up, you just take off one or two and replace, you'd be fine. But if you do the whole section, you would.
Right, okay, thank you.
Charlotte, thanks. Really interesting session. I'd be keen to get your thoughts on building on the energy efficiency and whole house approach, on how, I guess, the current drive to install heat pumps and use that kind of technology in listed buildings will progress, because I think there's a real conflict between making a building energy efficient enough to support installation of like low energy heating, and the need obviously to cut emissions and the current drive to install them.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, as I don't think technology is necessarily there at the moment to work with traditional properties. I quite often get asked questions about installing heat pumps, and then you have to make the building pretty much, you know, a sealed envelope to get them to work, and that's really difficult with traditional buildings. The whole construction of it is for it to be breathable, you know, to let the building work how it would naturally. I think that's probably the route that most people would say to follow, I think, and that would make it as energy efficient as it could be, without, you know, going down intrusive routes. Maybe in 5 years' time, technology might be better to be able to start thinking about heat pumps and different things. But yeah, at the moment, where they have been installed, they've only really worked in sort of the more modern parts of the building where they've had a large extension put in, and then they've got more of a traditional form in the other bit. So it's not quite working together, I don't think, at the moment.
I just come in there as well with all the students that come on our courses that are doing large restoration projects. I think a lot of people look at the heating first, because you might buy an old property and it's, you know, the heating needs doing, it's very old. But they're putting these systems in, and just reiterating what you said, Charlotte, they're not doing everything else. So they've still got the cement render, they've still got the gypsum plaster, so their homes are cold and damp. So you can put these fancy systems in, spend thousands, but really you're not going to get much benefit from it because your house isn't working as a whole. So in our most of our workshops that we do, we really reiterate, get all the basics sorted first before you start worrying about the technology side of things, because if you've got a damp home that isn't breathing, it's not insulated, you've got high external ground levels, there's just no point. You'll be spending thousands upon thousands, and you're just heating it to go out the gappy walls again. So get the basics sorted, which are usually the more cost effective things, before you get the expensive technical solutions. And hopefully by the time you've done that, the technology would have caught up, and we'll all be laughing because we've waited, and then it's all much better.
I think that's the same with solar slates. When I was first working in the docks, we were talking about putting some on one of the warehouses, and that probably was about 10 years ago. And I sort of said, oh, great, let's go for it. And they went off and they looked at how efficient they were and how much it cost to install. And it was just an absolute no-go. Whereas now it's such a common thing that you can add on. And it, you know, they do seem, technology just gets better and better, doesn't it? And I think give it 5 years, we'll all be doing it.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hello.
Thanks again for the talk. I've got a bit of a double question, but hopefully they're kind of open enough for everyone to get a bit of advice. The first one was, I guess, a bit of a myth buster. I've read somewhere, not sure where, but in terms of putting forward listed building consent, that you can effectively kind of list a number of items at once, and then I get consent on various items along the way. But once you start works on one of those items within 2 years, you've then got something like 7 years to complete that work, complete any item on that list. Is that correct, or is that?
So yeah, if you put an application in for sort of multiple works, so I don't know, re-roofing, internal alterations, putting up a garage, so to speak, and you only start work on one of those, that means that your consent has been acted and you can continue those works at any time. So there isn't a time limit necessarily. It may be that there could be conditions on the application that you might need to discharge aspects within a certain time for works to carry on. But in general, the rule is that yes, once you've got consent, you can then carry on with those works. So it's a little bit different to planning, whereas if you've got consent to build a house, your time's run out in 3 years, you couldn't start building it on your 5th year. So yeah, that is something which is true that you can do.
Okay, and just the second one was just long term we're planning an extension, and obviously it's a grade 2 star building, so it's, you know, might be tricky. But I don't know if you know if there's any resources that shows perhaps past extensions that have been approved on listed buildings, or I mean, you know, just sort of digging through Pinterest at the minute. I don't know if there's any sort of other resource that shows sort of successful projects, and even better in each. We're in the Vale of Glamorgan in Wales, and I'm trying to find a resource, you know, for ones that they've approved really. But yeah, anything on that really?
Yeah, so the local authority, you can go on their planning portal and you can have a good scroll through in terms of what consents have been granted recently. I always say go and have a chat to a conservation architect or have a look at some of their websites, and they'll give examples of projects of where they've done work or done extensions to properties. So they would be the ones I would say go and have a look at and see what works have been done.
Great, thanks a lot.
Okay.
I think we've had some questions in the chat box. So Caroline is looking for information on locally listed restrictions. She lives in a late 17th century property in Surrey and would like to know what she can do without contacting the conservation officer.
So if you want to know about if your property is locally listed, there would be something on the local authority website to say whether they have a local list or not, and they usually identify the properties within a schedule. So most have a sort of section on their website that talk about locally listed buildings. But if you want to know more in general just about local listing, then Historic England again also have a really good advice document about local listed buildings, how you can create a local list and all of those sorts of things. So I can dig that out and I'll pop that in the chat box, a link to that.
Rich Stern, did you have a question?
So I've asked mine already. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Well, if that's all the questions, then we'll tie up for today. As I said earlier, I'll send around Charlotte's slides to everyone and the document that she's done with all the useful links. If you do have any questions, then just drop me an email. If any of you are local to Gloucestershire, we're running an in-person workshop on insulating period homes on top of my head. I think it's the 13th of May, but don't quote me on that. But you can book it via our website anyway. Throughout the year, we'll have more online talks like this as well. So do keep an eye out for our e-newsletter for anything that might be useful to you. But thank you everyone for coming. I hope you found it useful and hopefully see you at another event soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.